State 1. Utah's Browning M1911. Most people know their own state has an official bird, an official flower, and an official flag. But Utah became the very first state in the entire country to designate an official state firearm, adopting the Browning M1911 pistol in 2011. The choice traces directly back to John Moses Browning, the legendary firearms designer born in Ogden, Utah in 1855 to a family of Mormon pioneers, whose 1911 pistol went on to serve as the standard sidearm of the U.S. military for 74 straight years. During the legislative debate over the bill, the state representative who sponsored it argued the pistol captured not just a piece of Utah history, but a piece of American history broadly, since Browning's design work extended far beyond this single pistol into rifles, shotguns, and machine guns still influencing firearms design today. Browning himself held 128 separate U.S. patents over the course of his lifetime and founded what eventually became the Browning Arms Company, credited with designing everything from the Browning automatic rifle carried by American infantry through 2 world wars to the Auto 5, the first successful semi-automatic shotgun ever brought to market. The specific 1911 design chosen for Utah's designation remained the official U.S. military sidearm from its formal adoption in 1911 all the way until the Barrett M9 finally replaced it in 1985, an extraordinarily long service record for any single firearm design. That 2011 vote didn't just honor a local inventor, it kicked off a genuine trend, inspiring roughly half a dozen other states to pass their own official firearm designations within just the following decade, each one looking to Utah's example as a template for how a state legislature could formally recognize its own firearms heritage. Browning's family had settled in Utah as part of the earliest waves of Mormon pioneers crossing the plains, and his father Jonathan ran his own gunsmithing shop that young John Moses grew up working in, learning the trade that would eventually make the Browning name synonymous with firearms innovation across an entire century of American manufacturing. That same design lineage eventually extended into the Browning high-power pistol, the Winchester Model 1894 lever-action rifle, and dozens of other firearms still manufactured and sold today, meaning Utah's single-state firearm designation actually points toward a body of work responsible for an outsized share of the most influential gun designs of the entire 20th century. State 2. Arizona's Colt Single Action Army. Arizona followed Utah's lead just months later in 2011, designating the Colt Single Action Army revolver, better known as the Peacemaker, as its official state firearm, developed for the U.S. Army in 1873 and remaining its standard-issue sidearm for nearly 2 decades afterward. The Peacemaker became just as popular among cowboys, lawmen, and outlaws across the Arizona Territory during that same frontier era, cementing its reputation as arguably the single most iconic handgun of the entire American West. Colt originally chambered the Single Action Army in .45 Colt, a cartridge the company developed specifically alongside the revolver itself, in the gun's simple, rugged single-action design, requiring a shooter to manually cock the hammer before every single shot fired, remained essentially unchanged across generations of production despite the eventual rise of far more mechanically complex firearms decades later. Modern reproductions of the Peacemaker remain in active production today, specifically because cowboy action shooting competitions and Wild West historical reenactments have kept steady demand alive for a design now well over 150 years old, with several manufacturers building faithful copies alongside Colt's own continued production runs. Arizona's specific choice of the Peacemaker over any other frontier-era firearm reflects just how thoroughly that one revolver came to symbolize the entire territorial period the state's own identity still draws on today, a legacy reinforced by countless Western films and novels that use the exact same revolver as visual shorthand for the entire era. Colt has manufactured the Single Action Army across several distinct production generations since its 1873 introduction, pausing output entirely during periods of the 20th century before eventually resuming manufacture to satisfy steady collector and shooter demand, and original 19th century examples in good condition now regularly sell for tens of thousands of dollars among serious antique firearms collectors. Arizona's own state archives note the bill passed with broad bipartisan support, a rarity for firearms-related legislation in most states, suggesting lawmakers across the political spectrum viewed the historical designation as cultural heritage rather than a policy statement about modern gun ownership. State 3. Alaska's pre-1964 Winchester Model 70. Alaska's state legislature made one of the most specific and, among rifle enthusiasts, most quietly controversial choices on this entire list in 2014, designating not simply the Winchester Model 70, but the pre-1964 version of that rifle by name. Winchester redesigned the Model 70's internal action in 1964 to cut manufacturing costs, replacing the original Mauser-style controlled round feeding system and hand-cut checkering with cheaper alternatives. Changes serious collectors and hunters have argued for 6 decades measurably hurt both the rifle's reliability and its collectible value. Senate President Charlie Huggins sponsored the bill specifically naming the earlier pre-1964 version, a deliberate nod to the exact model generations of Alaskan hunters had already relied on for big game hunting across the state's famously unforgiving backcountry terrain, where a rifle failing to feed reliably could mean the difference between a successful hunt and a genuinely dangerous encounter with a brown bear. The original Model 70, introduced back in 1936 and nicknamed the Rifleman's Rifle by shooters of that era, built its reputation on a robust claw extractor and a controlled round feed system that pushed each cartridge reliably into the chamber, even when a hunter was working the bolt quickly or at an awkward angle in the field. Exactly the kind of split-second reliability that matters most when facing dangerous game at close range. That specificity makes Alaska's designation genuinely unique among every other state on this list, since it doesn't just honor a rifle model. It takes a clear side in one of the longest-running debates in American rifle collecting history, one still argued over in gun shops and hunting camps across the state to this day. Winchester eventually acknowledged the strength of that ongoing collector preference by reintroducing a Model 70 built with a controlled round feed action decades later, essentially admitting the original pre-1964 design had genuine mechanical merits worth bringing back, even after the company had spent years defending its cost-cutting redesign as an improvement rather than a step backward. Alaska's own legislative record notes the bill drew support specifically from hunting and outdoor recreation advocates, framing the designation less as a statement about firearms broadly and more as recognition of a specific tool tied directly to the state's frontier hunting culture. State 4. Indiana's Grouseland Rifle. Every other state on this list named a specific model or design as its official firearm, but Indiana took a genuinely different approach in 2012, naming one single, one-of-a-kind physical rifle instead. The Grouseland Rifle is a handcrafted American long rifle built by Colonel John Small specifically for William Henry Harrison, the future 9th President of the United States, and it remains on permanent display today at Grouseland, Harrison's historic estate in Vincennes that's since become a National Historic Landmark. The rifle itself dates to the early 1800s, built in the traditional American long rifle style already common on the frontier by that period, and Harrison himself served as the first governor of the Indiana Territory before commanding American forces at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, a victory that helped launch his later political career and eventual, tragically brief presidency, since he died just 31 days into his term from pneumonia. Because the designation refers to that one specific physical object rather than a mass-produced model, Indiana's state firearm is the only one on this entire list that could never theoretically be purchased or reproduced by an ordinary collector no matter how much they were willing to spend. A genuinely unusual choice compared to every other state that simply named a production model instead. That uniqueness turns the Grouseland Rifle into less a celebration of a firearm design and more a direct, tangible link to one of Indiana's own founding historical figures, preserved in the exact house where he once lived and still open to visitors today. The Indiana General Assembly's resolution specifically cited the rifle's connection to Harrison's frontier-era leadership as justification for the designation, treating it less as a statement about firearms broadly and more as a preservation-minded gesture honoring one specific artifact tied directly to the state's territorial founding period, a genuinely different rationale than any other state on this list ultimately used. Grouseland itself, completed in 1804 as a brick mansion unusually grand for the Indiana frontier of that era, still displays the rifle alongside other Harrison family artifacts, letting visitors see the exact firearm named in state law without ever needing to travel to a museum outside the state. If you've ever wondered why your own state hasn't picked an official gun yet, that's exactly the kind of overlooked legal trivia this channel keeps digging up. Subscribe if you want the next one uncovered the same way. State 5, Tennessee's Barrett M82. Every firearm on this list until now traces back at least a century, and Tennessee broke that entire pattern in 2016 by naming the unmistakably modern Barrett M82, chambered in the massive .50 BMG cartridge, as its official state rifle. Nicknamed the Light 50, despite weighing over 30 pounds, the M82 was designed from the ground up by Ronnie Barrett, who founded Barrett Firearms Manufacturing in Murfreesboro, Tennessee in 1982, specifically to build a semi-automatic rifle capable of handling a cartridge that heavy reliably. Barrett reportedly built his first working prototype essentially by hand in his own garage, chasing the idea that a single shooter with a shoulder-fired rifle could achieve long-range anti-material capability normally reserved for crew-served weapons, and he secured his first real orders only after demonstrating the finished rifle personally to interested military buyers who had never seen a semi-automatic .50 caliber rifle work reliably before. That persistence eventually paid off during the 1991 Gulf War, when the rifle saw its first major combat deployment, disabling light vehicles and equipment at ranges no standard infantry rifle could ever hope to reach, cementing the design's reputation almost immediately after its introduction. Where every other state on this list reached back to the 1800s or earlier for a piece of frontier or founding history, Tennessee instead chose to honor a homegrown modern manufacturer still actively building rifles in the state today, a genuinely different kind of heritage than muskets or six-shooters represent. That choice makes Tennessee's designation the newest and most technologically advanced firearm named an official state gun anywhere in the country, and Barrett Firearms remains headquartered in the same state that eventually honored it by law. The M82 has since gone on to serve with dozens of militaries and law enforcement agencies worldwide, and its successful adoption also paved the way for an entire category of civilian long-range shooting built around the same massive .50 BMG cartridge, a niche that barely existed in any organized form before Barrett proved a semi-automatic rifle chambered for it could actually work reliably outside a laboratory setting. State 6, Texas's Colt Walker. Texas didn't join the official state firearm trend until 2021, a full decade after Utah and Arizona started it. But the state made up for the wait with a genuinely collaborative piece of firearms history, the Colt Walker revolver. Texas Ranger Captain Samuel Hamilton Walker had already carried Samuel Colt's earlier Patterson revolver into combat, most notably at the Battle of Walker's Creek, where a small, badly outnumbered group of Rangers held off a much larger Comanche force specifically because their 5-shot revolvers let them keep firing without the lengthy reload a single-shot pistol would have required. Walker approached Colt directly afterward with a detailed list of improvements he wanted: a bigger .44 caliber bullet, a fixed trigger and guard instead of the Patterson's fragile folding trigger, and enough raw power to reliably stop a charging horse and rider in a single shot during frontier combat. Colt, whose own firearms business had already gone bankrupt once by that point, partnered with Eli Whitney Jr.'s Whitneyville Armory to actually manufacture the new design, since he no longer owned a factory of his own, and secured a government contract on January 4, 1847 to build the guns at $25 apiece. Only 1,100 Colt Walkers were ever produced, with roughly a third reportedly bursting in the field due to the sheer pressure generated by a full 60-grain black powder charge, and today only around 170 examples are believed to still exist, with pristine specimens fetching well over $500,000 at auction among serious collectors. Choosing a revolver literally co-designed by one of its own legendary Rangers, born out of a desperate battlefield need rather than a boardroom decision, gave Texas a state firearms story no other state on this list can genuinely claim to match. The Walker's massive success in the field, despite its brief and troubled production run, directly convinced the U.S. government to place larger follow-up orders for an improved successor called the Colt Dragoon. essentially using the Walker as a real-world proof of concept that revolving pistols belonged in standard military service rather than remaining a battlefield curiosity confined to a single Ranger company. State 7. West Virginia's Hall Model 1819. West Virginia's state senate unanimously adopted the Hall Model 1819 flintlock rifle as its official firearm in 2013, honoring a design manufactured at the National Armory in Harper's Ferry that changed how firearms themselves got built. Designed by John H. Hall, the Model 1819 became the first breech-loading rifle ever adopted by any nation's military, letting soldiers load powder and ball through a lifting block at the rear of the barrel rather than ramming everything down the muzzle, a genuinely faster and safer process under fire that gave American soldiers a real tactical edge in rate of fire. Hall's real legacy runs even deeper than that single innovation, though, since manufacturing the M1819 required him to develop fully interchangeable machined parts, widely considered the first weapon in history built using that exact manufacturing method, a breakthrough that reshaped industrial production far beyond firearms alone. Because every single component was machined to identical precision specifications rather than hand-fitted individually the way earlier firearms had always been built, a broken part on any given Hall rifle could simply be swapped with the same part from a completely different rifle without a gunsmith ever needing to file or adjust anything by hand, a genuinely revolutionary concept for the year 1819 that predated the broader industrial adoption of interchangeable parts manufacturing by decades. The design wasn't perfect either, since existing manufacturing technology of the era couldn't fully solve gas leaking from the small gap between the lifting breech block and the barrel, a flaw that limited how widely the military ultimately adopted it compared to conventional muzzle loaders. The rifle remained in U.S. Army service long enough to see action through the Mexican-American War and the Civil War, the exact conflict that led directly to West Virginia's own creation as a separate state after splitting from Virginia. And some historians believe the rifle depicted on West Virginia's own state seal is actually a Hall Model 1819. Senator John Unger, who sponsored the designation, reportedly brought an actual surviving Hall rifle borrowed from the National Park Service onto the Senate floor during the debate, letting fellow lawmakers examine the genuinely unusual breech mechanism firsthand before casting their unanimous vote in favor of the resolution. State 8. Pennsylvania's Long Rifle. German and Swiss gunsmiths who settled in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania during the early 1700s took the short, large-bore hunting rifles of their own European homeland and radically lengthened the barrel, creating a genuinely new American design that traded raw power for dramatically improved accuracy at extended range. That original Pennsylvania barrel length often stretched well past 40 inches long, dramatically longer than the stubby European hunting rifles it directly descended from, a change that improved accuracy significantly at the cost of making the finished rifle noticeably heavier and less convenient to carry through dense frontier woodland terrain. That same Pennsylvania Long Rifle eventually became just as famous under a different regional name, the Kentucky Rifle, once. Settlers carried the exact same design west across the Appalachian frontier during the following decades, a naming shift some historians trace partly to a popular song celebrating Kentucky riflemen's marksmanship at the 1815 Battle of New Orleans. Colonial and frontier riflemen relied on the long rifle's superior accuracy for hunting game and, later, for genuinely effective long-range marksmanship during the Revolutionary War, a reputation that helped cement the weapon's status as one of the first truly American firearm designs rather than a simple European import. Pennsylvania's choice to honor the long rifle rather than any single-named model reflects just how much that one design shaped the entire colonial and early frontier era of American history, well before any of the more modern firearms on this list ever existed, and Lancaster County gunsmiths of that era are still credited today with producing some of the finest examples of the style any collector can find. Daniel Boone himself reportedly favored a Pennsylvania-style long rifle throughout his own frontier exploits, and surviving 18th-century examples, often decorated with elaborate brass inlay and hand-carved stocks unique to each individual gunsmith's personal style, remain highly sought after by American antique arms collectors, specifically because so few genuine period pieces have survived in good condition after nearly 3 centuries.